Hello, my name is Yvette Duran, and I'll be giving a presentation on VirtualU, defeating face liveness detection by building virtual models from your public photos. Let's begin. I'd first like to give an acknowledgement to the authors of the original body of work. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your names. Yi Xu, True Price, Jan Michael Fram, and Fabian Monrose, all from University of North Carolina. They originally presented this body of work in the 25th Usenex Security Symposium in Austin, Texas, back in 2016. This presentation is based on their literature from that security conference. This includes links to their own presentation as well as their PDF of their document. So first I'd like to go over the purpose and the general background of this work. Facial authentication is becoming increasingly popular in our society, especially due to its convenience. And although the security as well as the accuracy around it has improved, it's not secure enough. We're going to talk about what we consider the most advanced facial authentication systems to be currently, especially for the purpose of this presentation. We're also going to go over some of the vulnerabilities in these different systems and requirements to properly spoof them. We're also going to cover our approach to spoofing facial authentication systems. After the results, I'm going to tell you about some potential improvements that can be made to facial authentication systems security, namely light projection, pulse detection, and infrared illumination. I'll discuss all of those a little further. So let's first talk about some of the defenses as well as some of the problems. First one is texture-based approach. This analyzes the skin texture in order to authenticate that the face is real. It is supposed to detect differences in terms of shape, detail, resolution, blurring, shading, etc. However, given all of our advancements in high-resolution screens, the differences in texture between a real face and a spoofed face are becoming harder and harder to detect. The second one is motion-based systems. This relies on the motion of the user's head to detect subtle differences in the face that shows a 3D surface. A 2D surface, such as a photo or video, which are common spoofs, would not display 3D properties if the angle was altered. This does not protect, however, against 3D printed faces, which have also been used as a spoof against facial authentication systems. The third one is liveness detectors. This requires the user to display a specific expression or perform a specific movement in order to be authenticated. Some systems even give the request or the requests in random order. For example, something like raising your eyebrows, smiling, blinking, eye movement, head movement, anything along those lines. Most modern-day facial authentication systems incorporate both motion and liveness detection into the authentication, and for the remainder of this presentation, this combination will be considered the latest form of defense that we will be testing against. So the first one, in terms of the facial reconstruction approaches, is shape from shading, SFS. This requires only a single photo. It can be used by flashing a light and creating a model based off of the shading the light casts on the individual's face. However, this is not ideal for real-world scenarios because oftentimes there are multiple sources of light or the source is simply unknown and complicated. And for our specific use case, this isn't an ideal method. The second one is structure from motion, SFM. This requires multiple photos from different angles. It uses a stereoscopic technique to determine the depth and the angles of the face in order to make the 3D model. This requires a lot of images from different angles with no change in facial expression, which makes this approach unideal for our purpose. The third one is statistical facial models. This requires only a few photos. It uses a set of facial models of the population, which we'll be calling morphable model, in order to determine the general shape and appearance within that population. It's particularly great because it can capture the expression and identity of the individual as well, but we'll discuss those later. The morphable model can be trained with a controlled set of images or controlled online photos. This process can be automated and simplified by looking for key facial landmarks instead of looking at the entire image. These landmarks are then detected using supervised descent method, SDM, also known as deep convolutional networks. And those landmarks are mapped onto a 3D space. This method is very accurate. The only challenge is detecting landmarks, which can be difficult, especially around the cheekbones and contour areas, when the individual's face is rotated. But once that is accomplished, you'll have an untextured 3D facial model. Now we can talk about the researcher's specific approach to creating a 3D model creation. The first one, once you've obtained your collection of photos you gathered from their online social media, you can obtain the different landmarks for each individual photo. Once that's been accomplished, you can convert it into a 3D model, apply skin texture, correct the gaze so that it's facing forward, animate multiple expressions using that model, and once everything's been completed, you can load that onto a virtual reality system. So the first one I'm going to talk about is obtaining the landmarks. Once you have your collection of photos, supervised descent method will be used to detect the landmarks in each individual photo. These landmarks are going to be obtained for multiple photos, and it works accurately for most positions, as long as the head is not rotated too far. For landmark extractions, the technique was created by Zhu et al. And was used due to its accuracy and performance. Landmark validations can be done manually or through an automatic system. In our case, though, we did it manually. Once you have those landmarks, you can convert it into a 3D model. Creating an accurate facial model reconstruction is essential for the success of the spoof. It's important to keep in mind that the facial models are made up of two essential components: identity and expression. Identity you can see on the y-axis in the image on the left. It represents constant facial characteristics, such as the width of the face, the brow placement, lip size, placement of the ears in proportion to the rest of the head, anything along those lines. Expression is on the x-axis, which is what you would assume. It is smiling or frowning or laughing, any form of expression that's displayed on the face. In order to actually create these models, though, you have to use a mathematical formula that you see above on the top right. I'll go step by step and explain each individual variable. The first one, Sij, are the 3D coordinates of the facial model, which is what we're looking for. S bar I, or You can think of it more formally as the average of the 3D coordinates of the population, but it is what we'll be using as the base in this formula. AID and AEXP, or expression, are components that represent identity and expression, respectively. While alpha ID and alpha EXP are identity and expression vectors that are individual specific. This linear mathematical formula is used on a single image only, but depending on the quality and the angle of the face in the image, it may not be accurate enough. So what the researchers did was they created a model from multiple images of the victim. This allows us to somewhat average out the models to create a model with a more accurate identity value. So if they collected 5 different images of this particular individual, they'd create 5 models and average those models to create a more accurate representation of the identity of that individual. The final result should be a neutral face model, but it leaves us with an untextured model. So, next step is to apply texture. In order to apply skin texture, you have to use a single photo, preferably of higher quality. Right after application, there will be spots that are untextured, simply because of the angle of the face in the photo. Most modern facial authentication systems can detect this, so it's something we need to correct for. In the image you see, there's 3 potential solutions to somewhat fixing untextured skin on a model. The first uses something called vertical symmetry. In other words, the texture placed in an untextured part of the model will be copied from the pixel of texture next to it. This of course creates a lot of inconsistencies in what you expect of skin texture. There are ways of trying to make this more detailed, such as averaging out the texture of all the textured pixels around the untextured one and mixing it in with the copy of the pixel texture beside it. But this still isn't very accurate. Another solution is Poisson editing, which is the image you see in the middle. In this case, it's 2D Poisson image editing. It's often used to create a smooth and seamless transition in the image. However, it isn't accurate enough when done on a 3D model. So the researchers altered the 2D Poisson image editing so that it works for a 3D model. If you want to learn more about Poisson editing, I will link the article at the end. Now, we have a textured model, but the gaze might not be facing forward. And this is important because a lot of authentication systems rely on the direction of the user's gaze. They expect the user to be facing the camera. So there are 4 steps that we go through in order to correct the gaze. The first step, the RGB, or the red, green, blue color of the sclera, cornea, and pupil is analyzed and mapped onto a 3D space. Once that's been done, the 3D space that was just created would then be aligned with a predefined forward-facing eye, so the color is mapped into the corrected locations. The color analyzed from the model is then mapped onto the 3D space of the forward-facing eye. Once the forward-facing eye matches that of the victim's, it is then added back into the model to correct the direction of the gaze. And below, you can see the results of that. So now we have a forward-facing textured model. However, a lot of facial authentication systems require the user to display certain desired emotions, oftentimes blinking the eyes or raising the eyebrows. So we have to try to create a different facial expression given the neutral model. So once a neutral model has been calculated using the same formula that was shown earlier, you simply alter the equation with the appropriate expression vector, depending on what expression you're trying to calculate. Each expression will have a predefined value. So if you're trying to create a smiling model, instead of having a 0 in the value of that alpha j expression, which would represent a neutral model, you would input the predefined value of a smiling face and calculate as such. By calculating and modeling various expressions for the same identity, it allows us to use the different expressions to meet the requirements of different facial authentication systems, even if the demands are in different orders. Now that we've selected our images, obtained the landmarks, created the 3D model, applied a skin texture, corrected the gaze, and created various expressions of this model, we're ready to import our work into the VR system. In order for the model to display the 3D effects that would be expected if the person moves, we have to do a little bit of work. So we can break this into 3 steps somewhat. One is uploading the model into the VR system on a device, usually a smartphone. It could also be a tablet or a computer. A marker on a wall behind the device, which is near the rear camera, tells the VR system that the angle of the phone has changed and alters the model accordingly. The next step is that the VR model is displayed to the facial authentication system, and spoofing begins. So, what does that really mean? There are more sophisticated ways of doing this, but the rear camera detects that mark, and whenever there's a change in the angle of view of that mark, it can tell that the angle of the phone has been altered. It can change the face angle of the virtual model so that it matches that rotation. And it displays more of a realistic 3D effect for the authentication system. The more sophisticated ways of doing this are by using the environment to actually track the angle of the phone. You could use something like the corners of a table or the corners of a portrait, but this was the quickest and easiest solution. So at this point, we have a realistic 3D textured model of the victim's face with various expressions, and have implemented it into a VR environment, which will move in a realistic fashion upon the movement of the device. All that was left was to try to use it to spoof a facial authentication system. So now we can talk about the actual experiment that was conducted. It consisted of 20 participants, 6 female, 14 male, ages ranging from 24 to 44 years of age, with various ethnicities: Asian, Indian, African American, Hispanic, and Caucasian. Given their consent, all participants had photos collected from various social media and online sources. All photos were publicly accessible. The largest amount of photos collected for the smallest collected for a single individual was 3. The largest was 27. The mean was 15, and the standard deviation was about 6 per person. The process of selecting the individual from each photo was done manually. This can be automated, especially by using image tags, but in our case it wasn't necessary. We also used 5 different facial authentication systems in order to test our spoofing technique: KeyLemon, Mobius, TrueKey, BioID, and 1U. KeyLemon and 1U use liveness detection, while Mobius, TrueKey, and BioID use motion detection. We do believe that all of these use some form of texture-based approach as well, but it's not officially confirmed. These systems could have other forms of security, but it's not been shared with the public yet, and the information is limited. Now we can talk about our control test. So we had all 20 participants sign up in all 5 of the authentication systems using indoor photos, videos, or any other training model the systems required. Once they were signed up, participants validated that they could log into all the systems. They did this by doing 10 validations indoors and 10 validations outside in order to get an idea of how many false rejections some of these systems would give. We also took forward-facing photos of the participants in the same environment they were in when they set up their accounts. We created models of these photos and ran a control test against all of the systems. These models were able to spoof facial authentication systems 100% of the time using these models. There was not a single failure. So once we had our control tests, we could move on to using our social media images to actually create authentic VR models and attempt to spoof the systems again. In this case, Key Lemon had 85% success, Mobius had 80, TrueKey 70, BioID 55, and 1U was not successful. There were only 2 participants whose model did not pass any system, and those 2 participants in particular had very few photos, all of which were low resolution, which made it hard to create accurate facial models. 1U and BioID may be low due to sensitivity to change. What I mean by that is that some systems train with a lot less data from the individual when they make an account. These 2 systems tend to have high false rejection rates. For example, 1U only trains data on a user's face with a single image. So differences in lighting, environment, and appearances of the individual can cause a false rejection. In the instance where they are validating their accounts, when individuals went out and did 10 validations outdoors during sunlight, those 2, BioID and 1U, had significantly more false rejections than any of the other validation systems. So, how can we improve our security of these systems? Here's 3 recommendations. 1 is light projection. It involves turning on a pulse of light on the user's face in order to verify it is 3D and a real face. However, this can be integrated into the VR system by having hardware built in to detect the light and appropriately shade the VR face in near real time. This requires additional hardware and costs more, which would make it less likely to be used. In addition, there are some potential health risks, though, for individuals with epilepsy, for example. The second option is pulse detection. Pulse detection checks for subtle color changes in the face caused by the individual's pulse. This, however, can also be integrated into the VR system just by having subtle color changes in the face. And it requires no additional hardware and not much additional complexity. The most secure method is the final, infrared illumination. This requires there to be an infrared camera to detect the heat and determine it's a real person. This would this would successfully defeat our VR facial model. However, this also requires additional hardware, which makes it more expensive and harder for companies to implement. There is, however, one company that currently has this security feature implemented, and that is Microsoft, for Microsoft Hello. So, just to recap, VR facial model is a very effective and potentially inexpensive way of successfully spoofing the majority of facial authentication systems. And due to the amount of images out in social media that's very easy to acquire, it's not very hard to create the VR facial models. This proves that there's still a lot of vulnerabilities involved in these modern facial authentication systems that really need to be addressed. And hopefully, this is a way of getting that word out. I do want to make a final disclaimer note that these images and some information were copied directly from the original author's work, and all credit goes directly to them. I've also linked their research paper in here as well. Thank you again. I appreciate you watching.